So one of the joys of this park is that it's so big. It's right in the heart of Riverdale, but it takes up a huge amount of real estate. And with that in mind, we have used different parts of the park as our performance space. This is our most traditional space. This will be our 4th show in this space, but we've also used a grove of trees just south of us. And then last year when we did Romeo and Juliet, we used the southwest corner of the park, which is on a huge hill, and the performance actually happened on the hill. Now, because of that, lighting becomes an issue. How do you light an entire hill? And so our director and designer came up with an ingenious idea that actors would carry their own lighting and light themselves, which is kind of an untraditional way of doing lighting in the theater. And so we had these beautiful glowing orbs that we held with us and that lit up our faces and that we were able to kind of justify as part of the storytelling. And that was such a brilliant way of incorporating the site-specific nature of that hill and that space, and the director wanting to use the expanse of it all because it was operatic in scale and it left a huge impression on the people who saw it. So we're really happy to explore different possibilities. You know, these 2 trees in some ways represent a proscenium arch style or a thrust stage. So how do we break out of even those ideas of how theater should be? And this park provides us with all of these different landscapes to explore. So we've been in 3 different spots in the park already, and who knows where we'll go next.
So another point that we wanted to make about rehearsing in the space, with Vitals, for instance, Mitchell and Kath were working at Theatre Pass Marais beforehand, working on a lot of text work that kind of needs a bit more of a personal, intimate eye. But we had the rest of the cast from the beginning in here transforming the house into what it was going to become, which, like, I know this is a kind of a silly word to use, but like it really did feel like we were all claiming the house.
Like reclaiming, because
or
John
like,
and Shell had claimed it once,
yeah,
when they bought it.
Yeah, for sure. But claiming it for the show, let's say.
Totally.
Which I think is a really important moment for site-specific.
It is. It is a crucial step, I think. We've done this with, we did it with Burns, we were in the theater from the beginning, we did it with Marmalade, we were in the kindergarten classroom from the beginning, and it does allow you to make it your own. And I think it makes it more fun for both audience and performers because we are exploring the space from the beginning. We are hiding behind like walls of stuffed animals. We are, what are we doing? We are like building a secret wall. This room was like smaller. Remember there was a zipper screen?
Yeah.
I didn't even like...
And there was a bed behind there that was spattered with blood. And
awesome.
We'll show this to you later, but like there's another part of this room that we built like these trap rooms so that one of the characters who like goes out the door, it looks like they've jumped off the side of the building.
Yes.
Like they've actually just like gone into a little door that no audience member would ever know we built there.
That's right. At one point, Jesse jumped off the roof of the garage.
The garage,
to make it look like he was a subway jumper.
Yeah.
And there was a crash mat below, but you couldn't see that.
Yeah, exactly. And so like it really does take a lot of time.
It does.
To like get to know whatever space and to find all the nooks and crannies and stuff.
Someone got a message.
Oh, yeah, like it's...
Give yourself that time.
Give yourself that time.
It's fun. Like it allows you to be creative and play.
And like have your whole team be exploring the space too.
Yeah.
Because like the number of times that somebody's like, oh hey, like there's like a little thing over here that I saw that we can use for that. Or like, oh there's a hook on the ceiling that creates, and then like that becomes a major part of the production. So have your whole team creatively involved in the space, getting to know it.
Like Dana, one of our first responders was in, like they turned the basement into this whole thing. There was a bathtub and she had this whole scene. She was like, what if I just got in? And like, it was full of bubbles and like, what did you say? Started pulling.
She started like pulling notes and stuff out of the water and like candy and just giving it to people who walked in the room.
Yeah, it's great.
And these things take time.
Yes.
Another, get into that though. Another thing is so Rosamund Small, the amazing playwright of Vitals, you know, it's like a new original work. So one of the huge things was her watching the development of the show in the space and then being asked on the fly, okay, we're going to need you to write like a quick scene between one of the first responders and the main character that we're going to record, and the audience is just going to hear it on their headsets. So that's something that we wouldn't have gotten with Terminus or
Totally.
Mr. Marmalade. We actually had the playwright there in the room with us.
And originally, it wasn't meant to be site-specific. I mean, it did say it couldn't, but I don't think originally that was Rosamund's first intention.
And we had a partnership with Theatre Passe Muraille, which was sort of leading us towards doing it at TPM.
In a traditional theatre space.
Yeah, but
why?
Why?
Why have La Vanilla when you can have chocolate? Just kidding. I don't know.
A lot of people like vanilla.
And chocolate. Yeah, they're both.
Yeah. Neapolitan.
Neapolitan.
Why have vanilla when you can have Neapolitan?
All three, exactly. Yeah. Talking about strike, leaving the space better than we found it in, because this was a home that John and Shella had to come back and live in. And there was dirt and blood and tape everywhere, and paint.
So much stuff.
It was a long. It was a month-long strike process. Longer. Longer.
It was a long strike process. Yeah.
So it was like
it's like an ongoing strike process.
Right.
Like
it
we
still is happening.
We still find like little bits of
later.
dirt and tape and things
Quiet.
around the place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course.
But
included in it was a Heinz family home makeover.
Right? I think
we
talked about that. Though.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, we talked about that. And we can. Right now we're rolling images of what the show was like, and then what.
Totally,
yeah.
before and after.
Yeah.
And we're gonna talk about. What am I forgetting now?
Animals.
Oh.
Okay, so in a bunch of our shows, we've just tried to push the envelope a little bit, and so oftentimes we'll include animals in our shows. So
oftentimes, like in what other show besides Vitals?
We had crickets in Mr. Burns.
We had live.
We had live crickets, which is pretty cool. Yeah.
It was.
We had live crickets.
I'll take full credit for that idea.
Yeah, that was.
Mitchell was like, "Why?" He's like, "We should get the sound of crickets. Like, how could we do that?" And I was like, "What about live crickets?" So we had live crickets. Most of them are fine, doing okay.
So when we do enter a space, any space that we think might be a good space, we have built this kind of 2-page criteria where we just kind of do these quick questions to suss out the logistical constraints and gifts of a space, and it tells us what the creative potential is. So we'll kind of walk you through how we answered those questions when we entered this space almost 3 years ago.
So one of the, and this is more a logistical thing, but one of the things is like, I mean, having access, and you've mentioned, Matt, unique access to that. So it was really important that we have kind of full control over not only this space, but we'll go around this afterwards, but there's a corridor that kind of traces the perimeter, and that became our backstage. So it was important that we have access to that. Over on here, behind this wall, is where we did our costume and set changes. There's a washroom over here. We needed access to that. A lot of our lighting was behind doors. This door I think you're pointing at right now is where we had some floor flood lamps. We actually had access even beyond the building, because this bank of great windows here, our lighting designer, Patrick Lavender, had placed these colored LED lights behind the windows. So it was really, really sharp. But I mean, because we had the ability to do that, like in a lot of places, like no opening the windows, or you're restricted from that area. We needed a place and a partner really that was flexible and willing to at least entertain the idea of all these crazy ideas that we wanted to try out in the space.
And so, so we'll just start answering some of the questions that we would write down when we enter a space. And so Adriana's already talked about access, what kind of access you would have to the space. This is a community room for the church, so a lot of people are trying to rent it at various different days. So we had to book it well in advance for the month that we wanted. We didn't have unique access. We had a lot of access, but we couldn't afford to just book it right out. So that meant a lot of packing things up and putting them away every night, which is one of the big things with site-specific theater that you'll discover, is that you can't just leave your grid a lot of the time.
And so that was a big thing, and actually it was a big learning thing for us, because we weren't sure what like the whole lighting and set would be. So, you know, after the show closed, it took Pat, who we needed someone who was like very aware. So the setup and the strike of the technical equipment was kind of involved. We got better at it as the night went on, but it required taking all of that away, but then of course securing that as well. So if you can afford it, you know, get into a space where you have the key to the front door, you can just lock it all up. But, you know, depending on what kind of constraints and what else happens in these rooms or spaces afterwards, you may not be able to have that luxury.
So another thing we asked about is costs. Of course, this is a very arts-friendly, very community-friendly space, so the costs are cheap. This was like $15 an hour for the whole time we worked here, which is amazing and hard to come by. It's why we ended up going with this, because we prioritize having the maximum amount of rehearsal time in the space rather than having the ideal performance space. So we wanted a lot of time in the space rather than something grand and expensive, and that's what we ended up prioritizing for us in our process.
That's really important, actually. Like every time, and even going into our new production of Brave New World, is that we always, when we're looking at the budget and the finances, like we could spend money on, you know, on other things, but we always try to have the actors in the space, and we've we've done that. For example, at Pass Mariah, we're spending almost the entire rehearsal period in the actual main space of Pass Mariah, which is really costly and kind of unheard of, but in order for us to really integrate the show, the actors, the design into the whole architecture of the building, we feel it's a priority for the company to do that.
Yeah. Another big question is weather. In this space, it's less of a concern, but it's not a concern. I mean, we are with windows directly outside. That's something you definitely want to think about when you're working site specifically. How will weather affect your audience, and take measures to consider your plan for if it rains. Also, how it's going to affect the health of your actors is a big thing. When we worked in the shed, it was a major thing. It was late October, and there was often rain and freezing weather, so we had to tuck our audience in with blankets, and we had to have warm coats for our actors outside when they weren't in the scene. So that's a big factor to think about.
It was also a big thing for our person who was running our lighting board, which was Matt. He was outside of this little shed, but it's October, so I think there was even a day when there was snow. But a lot of times it was just like cold rain at like almost like fridge type temperatures. So we'd have to cover him with a tarp while he was working this lighting fader dimmer thing from like the 1940s or something.
Trying not to get electrocuted.
Yeah, and there were like these big wires that were plugged into where the dryer or the fridge would usually go into my basement. But we did take precautions, but it was like a huge thing for us because we were dealing with the elements in that particular show.
Which brings up the next question, which is power. When you're working site specifically, that hasn't necessarily been sorted for you, whereas if you're in a theater, they have power allocated, they have cable, they have all that stuff. With our shed show, we had to figure out where to run enough power to light our lighting and our board. So we ran these cables all the way through the backyard from the shed into the basement through a window, and had to restring that up every night.
Yeah, and that actually reminds me of another show that I was working on with Fevergraph, and we ran into a couple of things during the rehearsals where we were drawing too much power, and then things would just shut down.
Yeah,
which was scary. So I mean, unless you know about that type of thing, just get someone who knows that stuff. You know, like knows about electricity and that can look at these plans and figure it all out for you.
Yeah, working in this space, it's an old church. It doesn't necessarily have the most reliable power that a theater would, or a newer venue. So we had to spend a lot of time figuring that out. Pat eventually found a little kitchenette nearby where you could, again, plug into the stove outlets, and we had cable running all through the halls. So it's a big thing to consider, and it's something worth exploring a little bit earlier than you might in another venue. Next question is the lighting. And so when you're working in a site-specific venue, you're dealing often with practical lighting, which are like some of these fixtures up here, these beautiful fixtures that just kind of exist within the room. You're also dealing with natural light. So that is a constraint that you have to address. And it's a little bit hard to do matinees often because it's a completely different show than if it were in the evening. We didn't do matinees in the show just because it would have been a totally different atmosphere, and we like to be able to control the lights.
One of the things we have to do, and we've been like, there's websites where they, well, for both of these shows, for Birth of Frankenstein and Matchbox Macbeth, we were either outside or the outside light would bleed in. But we have to be very conscious on an annual basis of when exactly were we doing the show. It seems kind of logical, but you know, we couldn't do this show, for example, now in July because sundown is like 9:30 or something, and we wanted like a certain type of light. So we would go online and we would search for like when is sunset at October, which ended up being the date for both of these productions, and we know, you know, from memory that, oh, okay, October, it's like 7-ish, 7:30, and like that's a good time to start the show. So we were very conscious of that. And then if we were ever remounting it, really the only other time we could do it is probably the equivalent time in the spring, unless we wanted to do it like if we wanted that particular quality of light at that time.
So lighting actually ended up being a big steering factor in the shows we chose, actually, because we were working in the shed. We knew we wanted darkness, so we had to wait until we knew we wanted to, we had to wait till October to do a show. So then that led us to go, all right, what's a good kind of material to explore at that time of year? And so ultimately lighting was a constraint that was a big forcing factor for both of those productions.
It changed too. What was really neat about both of these productions is like it started like just when the sun was going down, but by the end of the show, within that hour, there was no light, at least from the sun. So it did like the whole, and both of these shows kind of like spiraled to a darker place by the end, which again suited those particular shows and informed the way we told that story.
Next thing on the list is sounds. So lighting and then sounds. What sounds naturally exist within the space? In this one, there's always different things happening in the space because it's such a community center. There's often drum groups. There's church services on certain days. So like I said earlier about Joanne being a champion for us, she was aware of this, and she was aware that our show was quite intimate and meant to be quite haunting. So she was a champion for us and flagged those early and moved them to different parts of the giant church that we're in.
But it makes a good point, like depending on the show that you're doing, whether, like how much do you want to leave to like happy accidents, or how much do you want to try to control the space? And sound is a good one to talk about because you really sometimes have very little room to be able to, to control your environment. So in this space, we could say like, Joanne, can you not rent that room over there? Yeah, no problem. But thinking back to Matchbox Macbeth, which took place, in one of those sheds in the back alley, like I can't tell my neighbors, don't drive your car between 7 and 8 p.m. because they have to do it, or don't walk your dog. So oftentimes we would open this big garage door and, Toronto alley life would be happening, Guy would be like jacking up his BMW and like fixing his car, dogs would be barking, we had to, I don't think we could have done it any other way, we had to incorporate that into the show because we knew that the potential was there for it to happen. And so we did, and we made it, and then it was like a little bit more playful. We made the characters respond to those types of environmental crazy things that could happen. But for Birth of Frankenstein, the tone is a bit different, so we tried to, then, brazen control a little bit more of especially the sounds that may happen in this room.
Yeah, if we could make it a little bit more of a sacred space that was just ours, whereas the alley, it had to have a humor that allowed the actors to react when something crazy happened in the alley, because it often did, and the show would have been broken if we didn't respond to the fact that there was going to be all these wild card things happening. And that ended up being what people loved most, is when the actors could use that sense of humor that we developed to respond when a car would drive by and people would be staring in at the audience sitting in the shed.
Yeah, and it was like simple things too. Like oftentimes, like I think what people find like really weird is like something like that's not supposed to happen in maybe a traditional theater happens, and like everyone just tries to ignore it. I remember Matt and I were at this we were at the show, and there was a man sitting in front of us, and he was like just talking and like saying all these kind of like inappropriate things, but then the actors were just trying to like go about their business and just muscle through it. But you know, for us, we'd like open the door, and then there'd be like a car beaming their lights at us, and it was just like, sometimes it was just a matter of simple just like pointing at that car and just acknowledging that it's there and like waving him on. And yeah, the audience was like, was that supposed to happen? Does that happen every night? Because yeah, we acknowledge a strange thing in play.
Yeah,
it was fun.
So in terms of sounds, it also applies to what kind of sound exists in the space. So one of the great gifts of this space is this beautiful old grand piano, and it has lots of beautiful sounds, slightly off key, which we kind of liked. There's also doors, and the sounds those make, if they creak, then you can use that as a gift. The floors creak. Like you can maybe hear it, it's a little bit creaky here, and so we had to use that when we wanted to, and kind of avoid it when we didn't want to. So we tried to treat the space like an instrument when we first meet it. We test it, we play it, we knock on the walls, we make sounds in the hallways to hear what that sounds, if it's like ghost-like, and one of the things that we discovered is that was a great gift of this space as well. So throughout most of the show, we had a kind of a rain track playing in the hallways that people kind of wondered if it was actually raining outside, just to create a kind of darker atmosphere for our show. So we do spend a great deal of time assessing the logistical constraints, but then we really enjoy moving on to the creative kind of inspiration that comes from a room. What is the natural character? Like if you assess it as though a set designer built this space, what information does it give you? What is it trying to tell you? What character is already existing? What stories are already being told by this space before you put a story in it? So when we first came into this one, what was attracted to us was its architecture. There's these great beams, this great fireplace, there's a great grand piano, great windows, lots of wood. We like the wood, the warmth of that. It brought up, it felt Victorian. It felt it's Victorian, but it had like Gothic influence as well. So we were working on Frankenstein, and it appealed to us. And what it ended up doing was teaching us to go more towards Mary Shelley's life, because it felt like a world where she might have inhabited. And so what we ended up having was focusing on her life, her environment, her home life, this great villa that her and Shelley and Byron and her sister went to and traveled to and had a great kind of exploration, and where the story ultimately struck her like a bolt of lightning when they had a ghost story competition. So we saw an opportunity to see her world and then show on these amazing white walls with shadow and how her imagination might come to life, and this story kind of erupting in her mind. So a lot of those ideas came just from the character of this space. So in order to get there, the questions that we ask are, we do these like quick fire questions like what does the atmosphere of the space bring to mind? Does the space feel public or private? This had a kind of privacy to it that we liked. It was different than a lot of the space. It felt more private, more intimate, more like you could be inside of Mary's head. What era? So we talked about it feels like it's Victorian. What characters live in this space before you impose a story on it? So who would live in this space? We felt like it could be, with the fireplace, it could be a family's den. If it wasn't in the church, we felt like this piano, it felt like it belonged to a family, which appealed to us, which ended up pushing us towards looking at Mary Shelley's family life. What else?
I guess there's also like breaking up the space too into different areas, like overall that could feel like that, but then when we brought the bed in, we were like, okay, that could be a bedroom. But we were also like, oh, it could also, you know, kind of serve as a boat, for example, with you know, putting some different lighting on there, or this area could look like an office, or so we started looking at the space in terms of segmenting different parts to see where they would serve the different locations of our story.
Yeah, we look for the natural stages that exist within a space and the natural frames that exist within a space. Because when you're building a set design, you tend to try and create playing areas, create like mini stages within stages, mini frames within the stage. So when you're assessing a space, you have to look for where are the gifts that already exist that you don't have to create. What is already there for you? So we had these great window frames. We had this fireplace. We had the door frames, which are so beautiful. And we start with literal use of them, like what Adriana said. We start with a bed as a bed, and then we devote a lot of time to playing with it with an expressive eye. So what can you change a bed into by using it in a different way, kind of how Adriana talked about earlier in our conversation. Another big thing we talk about, and this is one of my favorite questions when we look into a space, is what are the gods or the supernatural beings that govern the space? So if you're in an office space, it feels very corporate. The gods are the CEOs and the management of that space. Whereas if you're in a church, then you're obviously exploring some supernatural or higher beings, and those govern that space. But this being in a kind of back ladies' parlor of a church had a different feel than a sanctuary. For me, it felt a little bit haunted. It felt like there was ghosts that governed it. I'm trying to remember what we talked about when we first assessed it. But definitely a sense of creation. There's definitely, it's not definitely different than a corporate space. You're dealing with supernatural beings rather than higher powers like bureaucracy. What stories does this space tell on its own? Like what would make sense? Like what would be a literal use of this space? We felt like a lot of Ibsen or Chekhov could occur in this space. A lot of those well-made plays in the early 1900s. And so that was what would make sense. And then you go, what's a creative leap from that? Like what is something that's more exciting by forcing it into this space? We try to do something that doesn't necessarily make sense. And so for us in this world, Mary Shelley's life made sense within this space, but to have a crazy idea like the story of Frankenstein seemed radical. And that is actually Mary Shelley's life. Everyone was like, where did this crazy, dark, horrific story come out of this beautiful young girl? And we wanted to highlight through telling that story within what looked like her surrounding life and exploded into this kind of expressive exploration of creation and death and playing God.
I think that's important. That oftentimes, like, you know, you can read a script and it says, you know, it should take place, or it takes place in the library, and so your logical mind is like, okay, let's start looking for a library or a church, and that's, you know, that's the literal thing. And it could very well serve it very well, but I think what we find more interesting is like taking that, and I think the Macbeth play, Matchbox Macbeth, was a great example of like, that's completely unexpected, not only by the size, but you know, where it is, but there's something really fun about that, and it just brings like this whole other perspective to a story, which in our case we often choose stories that people are at least familiar with. So by doing that, it just makes you look at everything and with new eyes.
Mm-hmm. So one of the last things that we do is we kind of travel through the space and we kind of show. One of the things I ask the actors to do before we've started blocking or anything is we just get them to literally travel the space, walk through it, show us the gifts. And an actor's mind will show you things that you never thought were possible. Like the hardest thing for me as a director is to imagine trying to block things at a table with a little miniature. I like to see actors just like going wild in a space and showing me all the possibilities of it. And it gives me many more ideas than I would come with just with a logical brain at home. So that's been a key part of our process, just the actors having fun, traveling the space, showing me the gifts that exist.
And so, and to elaborate on that, I mean, at York, we went through a lot of different ensemble training. One of the things that a lot of groups use, and we do in our assessment of space, is the viewpoints kind of framework. So that helps us a lot. It gives us a structure. And for those of you familiar with that, as to just kind of really simple ways, like, you know, stand in a spot or choose a spot in the space that you think is powerful, or, you know, set up like a grid nature and just walk around. But it's amazing what you can find and see and the stories that emerge just by the relationship of bodies and space with the architecture of the room.
In a traditional process, you're often working with a taped out replica of your set, and you're not learning about the 3D world that you're going to inhabit until often Tech Week, just before you're going into the space. So that's the huge part of why we prioritize working in the space, is so I can see the actors leaning against the walls, interacting with the set pieces that are in the room. I find it just allows the actors to really own the space in a way that is really hard in the traditional Canadian theatre model. So that's become a huge priority for us.